Have you ever wondered what happens to cargo that's lost at sea? Whether it's weather related or user error, containers and its contents are lost at sea all the time. And some of those contents end up washing up on beaches all over the world. Welcome into another episode of Everything is Logistics, a podcast for the thinkers in freight. We are proudly presented by SPI Logistics, and I am your host, Blythe Brumleve. In this episode, Grace Sharkey is back for another mashup where we talk about lost cargo at sea. First, we're covering the story of friendly floaties, aka rubber duckies, that got dumped into the ocean, subsequently teaching us so much more about how ocean currents work. Then we're going to round out the show with another segment covering lost cargo, such as Garfield phones, coffee, and Legos. Hope y'all enjoy this one.
These are examples that stories that you could be telling within your own office.
Right.
So for mine in particular, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but it's called the friendly floaties. Have you ever heard of this? Just like off the
No.
top, you never heard of that phrase. Okay. So have you ever
Mm.
wondered what happens to a container if it falls off of a cargo ship?
Yes, because I lost some Ivy Park merchandise from a ship that lost containers. I never got my socks. So
Oh my
yeah.
God.
So basically Beyonce has like a bunch of stuff at the bottom of the ocean. Or maybe not. Are you telling me that it's somewhere?
Well, it depends on the product that was actually being shipped, because the overwhelming majority, and I'll play this clip here in just a second, but the overwhelming majority of freight, when it falls off of one, maybe weather patterns or, rough seas, obviously weather affects the rough seas. So what happens is these containers will fall off and it just becomes either a salvage situation where you can claim salvage rights, or it becomes a situation where they're just going to immediately be at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah.
So let me play this quick clip, because this particular freight that got lost was pretty buoyant. And so it hung around for a little while. Let me play the clip.
Cargo. Think about it. A container with two cars inside will obviously sink when it floods, while the same container filled with bath toys will instead stay afloat. This is actually what happened in 1992 when the Ever Laurel lost some of her containers in a storm while on passage between Asia and the USA. One container that went over had over 28,000 bath toys inside, meaning that even when the container flooded, it would still remain afloat because the toys would displace so much water, generating enough buoyancy for themselves and the steel container. Of course, we know that for whatever reason the toys got out, so that container will have sunk, while the toys spent the next few decades riding the ocean currents, giving scientists an unexpected insight into ocean flow patterns worldwide. Anyway, the point is, the only way for a container to remain afloat for a prolonged period is for it to contain cargo that is sufficiently buoyant, and for that cargo to remain secure enough that it doesn't get out.
So I'll set that up
crazy.
a little bit more, but that's essentially what happens. It depends on the cargo that is actually being shipped. And so this particular incident is called the Friendly Floaties Spill. And it was a bunch of bath toys, like not bath toys, but like rubber duckies, some other
Yeah.
bath, type animals that have a similar like buoyancy level to it. And because of this situation, that all of these rubber duckies, literally 28,000 of these rubber duckies were released into the ocean. We're still finding them to this day. This happened in 1994, I believe is what the video said. But we learned so much about ocean currents from this spill, because there was this doctor that or this professor that studied where all of these rubber duckies were ending up, and some of them were ending up in the Australian coastline. We figured out that to go through one full ocean current cycle takes 1 year. So these duckies, they were still washing up a year later in massive. I mean, there was 28,000 of them, so they were ending up in all areas of the world. And what I thought was really cool is that for a lot of us, that we didn't understand, especially those who work in ocean shipping, they didn't understand a lot of how these ocean currents work, and what we don't know what we don't know, right? And so
Yeah.
for some of these companies, especially how trade lanes are established. So trade lanes meaning what route is your ship going to take from one country's port to another port? What's the most efficient way to do that, where you can kind of ride the currents and get there more efficiently, avoid the bad weather. It's very, very like
Yeah.
booking a ship is very similar to booking a truck. And I don't know why that blew
Yeah.
my mind when I found out about it. I just assumed like you book the ship and it takes the quickest point, from port to port. That's not the
Yeah.
case. They use different ocean currents. And because of that situation, they were able to find and establish new trade lanes based on the
Whoa.
on how the little rubber duckies like ended up all over the place. And I thought that that was so cool. And another cool part of this is that it was
What?
turned into a children's book. So it's called
What?
Ducky. I ordered this yesterday, so it actually should get here. I was hoping it would get here in time, but it hasn't gotten here yet. But let me share this little book, and it is so cute. Where it
Oh my
has a
God.
cute
You know who
little.
you should send that to Lauren Began. She just had a baby too, and she loves
Oh, okay.
maritime. Oh
Isn't
my
this cute? And
God.
so it got me thinking, like, how are we teaching kids about the
Oh my
supply chain? Like, if you're just listening to this, it's like the cutest little rubber duck that's on the cover of it. It's called Ducky, and one of the intro pages says, "I am a yellow plastic duck, and I am in great danger. Yesterday, I was snuggled safe with hundreds of other bathtub toys. We were in a crate on a big ship. A storm came, and our crate was washed overboard." So it shows a little picture of like a wet,
so
duck that is
cute.
obviously scared, and all of the different things that you learn from this. And so I thought that it was one of those stories that I was like, "Oh, this
Beautiful
is such a
art.
cool video." And let me really quick, that video that we just listened to came from Casual Navigation on YouTube. That it's a great follow for, sort of, casual navigation stories. But I thought that that was when I saw that video and I was looking up on Wikipedia on how this story sort of evolved and all of the insights that came from learning about the ocean shipping patterns and things like that, and learning where these different where I guess salvage rights, and we could spend
Yes.
probably an
Right?
entire show on
Maritime
salvage
law.
rights. Yes, it's just so like ancient and
Yeah.
fascinating. And there was this other video that I did want to show too, because that's really like the cute side of it. So that, the children's book came out of it. But then on the other side, is where I wanted to loop it back around to cargo crime, because some of these floating containers just end up in the middle of the sea or middle of the ocean, and it causes danger for some of like maybe sailboats, for example, because only part of the container is kind of sticking up out of the
It's
water,
like an
and you don't have
iceberg.
time to maneuver around it. So
Yeah.
if it hasn't sunk yet, depending on the product that it's carrying, it might remain buoyant for longer than you would imagine. But then there was another incident where, and I'll share this tab here, of these other folks that stumbled upon these merchant, I think fishermen that stumbled upon a container that was floating in the middle of the ocean, and it had cigarettes in it.
Oh,
And
hell yes.
so all of the merchants, they cut
Oh
a hole
my God.
in the container that's floating in the middle of the ocean. And so they start ripping out all of the cigarettes from the
Look at
ship.
them.
Obviously, you probably see that if you're a fisherman and you're like, "Oh, well, what's in here?" Salvage rights, technically, you can seize that. You can lay claim, as long as nobody else is laying claim, like ownership wise. Which, if you think about it, I'm sure the insurance companies maybe saw this video, and maybe had something to say about this process. But I thought it was a really cool case of like, okay, this is what happens when it's stuff that people actually want, that they're going to find a way, or just
Oh, hell yeah.
curiosity, that they're going to try to find out what's inside of there and see if it's worth anything. And I'm sure for a lot of these guys on the boat, finding a lot of those cigarettes, boxes and boxes, it was estimated to be millions of dollars in cargo worth of
Easy.
just cigarettes.
Oh my God. Especially depending on what country they're from, like even if they have that type. Oh, that's so cool.
Oh,
Those
and I
guys
was
those guys just are like generational wealth. Like we just hit the jackpot.
Are you in freight sales with a book of business looking for a new home? Or perhaps you're a freight agent in need of a better partnership? These are the kinds of conversations we're exploring in our podcast interview series called The Freight Agent Trenches, sponsored by SPI Logistics. Now, I can tell you all day that SPI is one of the most successful logistics firms in North America who helps their agents with back office operations such as admin, finance, IT, and sales, but I would much rather you hear it directly from SPI's freight agents themselves. And what better way to do that than by listening to the experienced freight agents tell their stories behind the how and the why they joined SPI. Hit the freight agent link in our show notes to listen to these conversations, or if you're ready to make the jump, visit spi3pl.com.
And while, one last quick thing, because I know you got to go, but there's another incident of this is such an insane story because it led me down this rabbit hole of, okay, like, oh, salvage rights. Well, what technically is salvage rights, and what can come from these types of different conversations? And so for this other example, have you ever, it's wild because there's an example of a person that, or a British pilot, he ran into some trouble. He had about a minute of fuel left in his plane. He had to do an emergency landing. And the closest thing around him was a cargo ship. He had to land the jet on top of the containers on a floating cargo ship in order to not die. So he was a British pilot. He landed on a Spanish or a cargo plane or a cargo ship from Spain. So Spain ends up claiming salvage rights on the jet, and then they're able to get the British to pay to get the jet back. And it's wild because obviously you're in the middle of the ocean. It's a little bit slippery. So this plane it covers it once it lands on top of the containers, then they hit some waves and it falls back and hits a van that's on top of the cargo ship. And so let me play this video because it's wild that this reporter is doing a story in front of this. So I'll pull this up on the screen now.
It's crazy.
Okay, here we go.
In the end, it's been a story of mixed fortune for Lieutenant Watson. Warming up for his first major NATO exercise, he suddenly finds himself in the headlines and 4 days adrift from his Harrier squadron. For the way in which he skillfully managed to land on this crowded cargo deck, there was much praise and much relief. But the worrying question remains, exactly how did he find himself in such a dire situation in the first place? So Lieutenant Watson's fate is still not certain. But as a party of British naval engineers and mechanics got to work attaching lifting gear onto the Harrier, clear that no action would be taken until a Naval Board of Inquiry has investigated the affair. The Harrier will be taken back to the United Kingdom after being loaded onto a British tanker, which is expected in Tenerife tomorrow afternoon.
Isn't that insane?
So crazy. And then it's just so nuts that, like, it's not technically owned by them at that point either. Interesting.
And that's what ended up happening with the
case. How did he land like that?
I guess like the jet propulsion that he could just land straight down, almost like a helicopter. Because that was my first question too, is like, how the hell do you land on a cargo ship? Because I've been on a naval carrier before, and they have the area where you can land and take off, but to land straight down obviously takes a lot of skill, and apparently that pilot had only completed about 75% of his training. That's a pretty good pilot.
18 years old. Yeah, geez. Wow, that's incredible.
So that's how I brought it back to the cargo crimes, is that Spain basically found themselves in the hands of a British jet and made the Brits pay to have it back, which is probably one of the few ways that you can get the Brits to give things back nowadays. Just have a salvage rights. So if any museum, especially like Egypt or anybody else that's looking to get some of your stuff back, maybe try salvage rights, because the Brits do listen when it comes to that.
That's so funny.
I just love that story so much. And I love that it taught us so much about ocean currents and where you're turning something involving essentially pollution into a positive and learning something from it. Now, next up, let's learn about Garfield phones, Legos, and coffee, how all three of those commodities have washed up from containers lost at sea onto some unsuspecting beach residents who continue to find these items still to this day.
In that container was a bunch of rubber duckies and kind of, they call it floaty friends, which is, just different animals in the same shape as a rubber ducky. So they all spill out into the ocean. They teach us a bunch about ocean currents, things that we never knew, like these duckies are ending up in England and Australia. So it was obviously it's a sad story that a lot of this pollution like ends up in the ocean, but on the positive side of things, it did teach us a lot about that. And it led into like a giant rabbit hole of, just containers lost at sea and things like that. And so I think my algorithm now on TikTok is absolutely geared towards that, because I get all those stories now. And I say all those stories, but I'm going to bring up this next one because it's the mystery of the Garfield cat phones. So I don't know if your cat is still around. So hopefully maybe she'll find this interesting. But
Brokering success demands a battle-ready strategy. Tide TMS equips freight brokers with the ultimate battle station for conquering a tough market. With Tide, brokers gain access to a comprehensive platform where rate intelligence and quote history converge on a single screen. It's not just a page, it's a strategic command center designed to help brokers win. Tide equips your team with all of the data they need to negotiate with confidence and allows them to communicate directly with carriers and customers from a simple control base. Revolutionize the way your brokers perform by giving them a competitive advantage with Tide TMS. For more info, go to tai-software.com/battle stations, and we also have a link for you in the show notes to sign up for a demo.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
Someone told me this story years ago, and I always thought it was a joke until like a couple weeks ago when I saw a TikTok about it. So I had to look it up, and it's real. So essentially, since the 1980s in the Brittany region of France, collectible Garfield phones have been washing up on shore, and nobody knew why. For 35 years, these creepy Garfield phones were just washing up on the beach by the dozens. Then finally, a farmer who lived in the area discovered a container ship that had been hit by a storm and washed up inside of a sea cave. He said the cave was nearby, but you had to know the area really well to find it, so no one had discovered this shipwreck. And in the shipwreck, they found an open container that was full of Garfield phone stock and was slowly seeping out to sea and washing up on shore. Is it useful information? No, but it's hilarious.
So funny.
I love that, because for 35 years, these people had no idea of what where these Garfield phones were coming from. And so I was reading through the comments, there were a bunch of other people that, of course, listed that were talking about the ducky story, which we've already talked about. But then there were these other people that were talking about, there's another story of back in 2015. Let me switch to this tab. So back in 2015, container went overboard during rough seas, and Cafe Bustelo, the coffee brand, one of the containers went overseas.
I love that coffee. It's so good and it's so cheap.
Well, on a Florida beach, where a Florida beach is thousands of tins of Cafe Bustelo is washing up on the beach. And so it was just like this massive thing that, beach goers, they could go and they could essentially like fill up an entire trash can or trash bag of these still sealed. I guess, kind of tying back to the makeup story, like, how do you know if it's been contaminated or not? But if you have ever had a Cafe Bustelo, you know that if you take the yellow lid off, they have that metal tin that is, that you can rip off and then start using the coffee. And so there's literally, if you're watching it right now, or if you're just listening to it, there's a man just like on the beach with a garbage bag and he's filling it up with Cafe Bustelo tins. So that was one that I thought was really interesting and that I did not know about. There was another one, which I'm probably going to see this on a future What the Truck episode, because this one is when a container went overboard and millions of Lego pieces were lost at sea 25 years ago. Those pieces are still washing up on the English coast. So the backstory on this is on February 13th, 1997, a stormy weather caused Tokyo Express container ship to tilt more than 45 degrees, causing 62 containers to go overboard. One of these containers carried 4.8 million pieces of Lego, and more than 23 years later, Lego bricks are still washing up on Cornish coastlines in southwest England. And goes on to say that, according to Delia Webb of the Cornish Plastic Pollution Coalition, that's a alliteration hell, but volunteer beach cleaners are regularly finding Legos to this day, which is a sobering reminder of the enduring nature of plastics in our environment. But basically, yeah. So, 23 years ago, a container goes overboard, and people are still finding these things on the beach. So, coffee. We have Garfield phones, we have rubber duckies, and Lego pieces now that have all been reported over on TikTok, which I think is just fascinating that, there's random people that are finding these things on the beaches and have no idea like how global supply chain works.